I'm glad you're here at Beyond 60 Stories, where every life has a story to tell. Have you ever wondered why years after a relationship ends, some women are remembered with warmth, clarity, and quiet longing, while others slowly fade into the background of a man's memory? Even if they were beautiful, devoted, or deeply involved at the time, many people assume that what stays with a man is passion, attraction, or dramatic moment. But as life unfolds and time does its quiet work, what remains is something far more subtle and far more powerful. As men grow older, memory stops clinging to excitement and begins holding on to how someone made them feel about themselves, about life, and about who they were allowed to be in that woman's presence. In today's video, we're exploring why certain older women stay in a man's mind forever, even years later, not because they tried to impress, chase, or perform, but because of 4 deeply human qualities that imprint themselves quietly and permanently. These are not tricks, techniques, or dating strategies, but ways of being that only maturity, experience, and self-awareness can shape over time. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Beyond 60 Stories, because every story shared here is meant to be felt, not rushed and remembered. Lesson 1. The way she makes him feel at peace with himself. What stays in a man's mind long after time has passed is rarely a specific moment or a dramatic gesture, but the quiet emotional climate he experienced when he was with her, because as men age, memory becomes less about excitement and more about emotional safety. And the woman who remains unforgettable is the one who never made him feel like he had to defend, perform, or constantly prove his worth. An older woman who lingers in a man's thoughts is not remembered for how much she needed him, but for how calm he felt in her presence, how his shoulders relaxed without him noticing, how conversation flowed without tension, and how silence never felt like punishment or distance. There is a rare maturity in a woman who allows a man to be exactly who he is in that moment without correcting his past, reshaping his future, or quietly measuring him against expectations he never agreed to carry. Men over 60 become especially sensitive to emotional friction because they have lived long enough to know how exhausting it is to constantly navigate judgment, disappointment, or unspoken demands. And when they encounter a woman who brings emotional steadiness rather than emotional pressure, something inside them settles deeply and memorably. This kind of woman listens without preparing her response, disagrees without trying to win, and shares her thoughts without making them weapons. And over time, a man associates her presence with relief, clarity, and inner quiet, which is why even years later he may find himself thinking of her during moments of stress or loneliness. She is remembered not because she tried to hold on tightly, but because she knew how to create space, not distance, but space where a man could breathe, reflect, and feel respected without explanation. This does not mean she was passive or invisible, but rather that she had done enough inner work to stop using relationships as places to resolve old wounds, and instead showed up whole, grounded, and emotionally self-contained. When a woman reaches this stage of life, her energy changes because she no longer seeks validation through reaction, nor does she confuse intensity with intimacy, and a man senses this immediately, even if he cannot put it into words. Over time, that feeling becomes associated with safety, dignity, and emotional rest, and those sensations imprint far more deeply than passion alone ever could. And as we move forward, the next lesson explores a subtle quality that often surprises men the most, because it has nothing to do with attraction or behavior, but with how an older woman relates to her own life, and how that independence becomes quietly irresistible over time. Lesson 2. Lu, her quiet independence that never asks to be rescued. there is a particular kind of attraction that grows stronger with time rather than fading, and it comes from an older woman who does not revolve her life around a man, not because she is distant or closed off, but because she has already built a life that stands on its own. Men over 60 are acutely aware of emotional dependence, because many have spent decades being needed more than being chosen, and when they encounter a woman whose stability does not hinge on their attention, something inside them shifts from obligation to desire. This kind of woman does not use companionship as a solution to loneliness, nor does she quietly ask a man to fill emotional gaps left by the past, and instead, she brings a full inner world into the relationship, complete with routine, interests, and a sense of direction that existed long before he arrived. Her independence is not loud or performative, but deeply settled, and it shows in the way she speaks about her life without apology, in how she makes decisions without seeking permission, and in how she welcomes a man into her world without handing him the responsibility of managing it. What men often find unforgettable is not that she does not need them, but that she allows them to be present without being required to fix, save, or stabilize anything, which creates a rare emotional freedom that many men did not even realize they were missing. Over time, a man begins to associate her presence with dignity rather than pressure, with companionship rather than caretaking. And this distinction leaves a lasting imprint because it allows him to show up as himself rather than as a solution. An older woman who lives this way does not chase reassurance, nor does she interpret space as rejection, and her calm response to distance often deepens a man's interest rather than diminishing it, because it signals emotional maturity and self-trust. This independence does not make her cold, but grounded, and it allows affection to grow naturally instead of being negotiated through fear or expectation. Men remember this because it contrasts sharply with relationships where emotional gravity felt heavy, where every interaction carried an unspoken demand. Years later, when a man reflects on the women who stayed in his mind, he often recalls the one who had her own rhythm, her own anchors, and her own sense of peace, because being with her felt like joining a life rather than being absorbed into one. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, or if you are learning how to reclaim your independence after years of dramatizing others, take a moment to share your experience in the comments, because many women only discover this freedom later in life, and your story may help someone realize that independence is not a threat to love, but one of its strongest foundations. Lesson 3. The way she hosts intimacy without needing to control it. What many men over 60 notice during intimacy is not technique, appearance, or performance, but something far quieter and far more revealing: the way an older woman relates to closeness without trying to manage it. This lesson sits at the very center of why some women remain unforgettable long after a relationship ends, because intimacy at this stage of life is no longer about proving desirability or securing attachment, but about emotional presence without pressure. An older woman who stays in a man's mind forever is one who does not rush intimacy to calm anxiety, nor withhold it to create leverage, and instead allows closeness to unfold at its own pace, trusting that connection does not disappear simply because it is not constantly reinforced. Men are deeply sensitive to control during intimacy, especially later in life, because many have spent years navigating relationships where closeness came with expectations, negotiations, or unspoken conditions, and when they encounter a woman who can be emotionally and physically present without trying to steer the moment, it creates a sense of safety that lingers long after the encounter. This kind of woman does not watch herself through a man's eyes while being close to him, and she is not measuring his reactions to decide whether she is wanted. And this absence of self-monitoring allows intimacy to feel grounded rather than performative. Men remember how they felt in these moments because they were not being evaluated, managed, or subtly guided, but simply allowed to be present, which is rare and deeply disarming. Her comfort with intimacy shows in small ways, in how she does not fill silence with reassurance seeking, in how she does not interpret a pause as rejection, and in how she remains emotionally steady even when closeness stirs vulnerability. This steadiness signals emotional maturity rather than detachment, and it tells a man that intimacy with her is not a transaction, but an experience. Not something to be maintained through effort, but something that exists naturally when two people are aligned. Over time, this creates a powerful emotional memory because men tend to associate intimacy with pressure or performance. And when those elements are absent, the contrast becomes unforgettable. Years later, what a man recalls is not a specific moment, but the feeling of being able to relax fully in her presence, of not having to lead or reassure or prove anything. And this memory becomes a quiet reference point against which future connections are unconsciously compared. Lesson 4. The way she leaves without chasing, explaining, or erasing herself. One of the most powerful reasons an older woman stays in a man's mind for years is not how she enters his life, but how she leaves it. By the time people reach their 60s and beyond, men have experienced many forms of endings, some loud and dramatic, others slow and unfinished. But what lingers most is the rare experience of a woman who can step away without pursuit, without self-betrayal, and without rereading herself to soften the loss. An older woman who remains unforgettable understands that dignity is not something granted by a relationship, but something she carries regardless of how a connection ends, and this understanding quietly reshapes the emotional memory she leaves behind. When intimacy fades or circumstances change, she does not chase clarity to soothe anxiety, nor does she disappear in bitterness to protect pride, and instead she leaves with emotional coherence, allowing the ending to be honest without being destructive. Men notice this deeply because many have been conditioned to expect endings to come with accusations, bargaining, or emotional collapse. And when those patterns are absent, the silence that follows becomes heavier than any argument. Her ability to walk away without diminishing herself sends a powerful signal that the connection mattered, but did not define her worth. And this balance creates a lingering respect that does not dissolve with time. She does not demand that he understand her fully, nor does she try to remain unforgettable through reminders or nostalgia, because she trusts that what was real will remember itself. This trust allows the ending to settle rather than explode, and men often replay these moments years later, not because they regret the ending, but because it was the first time an ending felt clean, grounded, and emotionally adult. There is something deeply unsettling and attractive about a woman who does not need to be chased after she leaves, because it forces a man to confront the connection without distraction, and this confrontation often happens long after the relationship itself has ended. Her absence is not loud, but it is complete, and that completeness becomes a reference point for emotional integrity. Over time, many men realize that what they miss is not the relationship itself, but the way she respected herself within it and beyond it, because that self-respect quietly reflected their own emotional limitations. What stays in a man's mind years after a relationship ends is rarely the woman who tried hardest to be loved, explained herself the longest, or adjusted herself to fit his expectations, because time quietly erases effort but preserves truth. The older woman who remains unforgettable is the one who lived from a place of wholeness, who did not confuse closeness with control, presence with pressure, or love with self-sacrifice. She allowed connection to exist without forcing it. She offered intimacy without managing it. And when the time came to leave, she did so without chasing, blaming, or disappearing into bitterness. This combination is rare, especially later in life, because it requires emotional maturity, self-respect, and the courage to let outcome unfold without clinging to them. Years later, when life slows down and memory becomes selective, men do not replay conversations or physical details, but they remember how safe they felt to be themselves, how calm the space was around her, and how she never abandoned herself to keep them close. That memory becomes a quiet benchmark, not a source of regret, but a reminder of what real emotional integrity looks like. If these reflections resonated with you, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to Beyond 60 Stories so we can continue sharing honest conversations about love, presence, and connection in this season of life.